Flight 12's booster was lost, slamming into the ocean at 1,400 kilometers per hour, but the heat shield survived. Zero damage, all the way to splashdown. After Flight 10 and Flight 11 came back scorched and cracked, SpaceX just eliminated the flaw that almost ended Starship's reusability dream. One fix, one tile change, and it worked. Here's exactly what SpaceX did, and why Flight 13 could be the mission that changes everything. Let's rewind to the exact moment things went wrong. 33 engines fired under Super Heavy. Liftoff looked flawless. Then shortly after the tower cleared, one engine on the booster shut down. Not scheduled, not planned, just gone. That single engine loss didn't end the mission, but it started a chain reaction. As Super Heavy pushed higher, more engines began cutting out and restarting erratically. By the time the booster reached its boost back burn, the maneuver that turns it around and sends it home, 5 of the 33 engines refused to relight. 5 engines, out of 33. That's less than 16% of the booster's total thrust, missing at the exact moment precision mattered most. Here's why that number matters. Super Heavy doesn't fly like a normal rocket stage. It's a controlled fall, corrected in real time by dozens of engines working together like a swarm. Lose a few, and the swarm has to recalculate everything: trajectory, thrust balance, timing, in milliseconds. The booster fought through it. It survived the boost back burn. It survived the coast back down through the atmosphere. Then came the landing burn. 13 center and inner ring engines lit to slow the booster down for splashdown. And this is where the story turns dark. Data now confirms Super Heavy was still traveling at over 1,400 kilometers per hour just before it hit the water. For reference, a commercial airliner cruises at around 900 kilometers per hour. Super Heavy hit the ocean 500 kilometers per hour, faster than a plane flying at altitude. The booster was lost. Meanwhile, 40 seconds after stage separation, Starship had its own scare. One of its 3 vacuum Raptor engines shut down. The ship kept flying. It completed its mission. But SpaceX now had 2 separate engine failures on 2 separate vehicles in the same flight. 2 failures, 1 flight. That's the situation SpaceX walked away from after Flight 12. The detail almost nobody talked about. Here's what makes this story more interesting than a simple pass or fail headline. While the engines were failing, something else was happening in parallel. And it was going right. The heat shield. The single most difficult unsolved problem in Starship's entire program survived Flight 12 without a scratch. Think about what a heat shield actually has to survive. Starship re-enters the atmosphere at roughly Mach 25, 25 times the speed of sound. The plasma building up around the vehicle reaches temperatures hot enough to vaporize most metals on Earth. Every previous flight, tiles cracked, tiles fell off. Engineers found scorch marks and oxidation damage across the airframe after splashdown. Flight 10 came back scarred. Flight 11 came back scarred. Flight 12 came back clean. Compare that to a car tire that's been driven at highway speed for 100,000 miles with 0 wear. That's roughly the leap in performance between Flight 11's heat shield and Flight 12's heat shield, based on the oxidation data SpaceX has released. So here's the real picture of Flight 12, the one most coverage misses. The part of Starship everyone assumed would be the hardest to solve. Solved itself. And the part everyone assumed was already reliable, the engines, is what actually took the booster down. That's not a failure story, that's a plot twist. Let's break down why Raptor engines failed twice on the same flight in 2 completely different phases of the mission. Because the causes are not the same problem wearing 2 different masks. On the booster, the issue centers on relight reliability. Every time a Raptor engine needs to shut down and fire again mid-flight, it has to re-establish combustion in an engine bay that's still full of residual propellant vapor, vibration, and heat from the previous burn. Multiply that by 33 engines, all needing to relight within a tight window, and you have 33 separate chances for something to go slightly out of sync. SpaceX's own explanation adds a critical detail here. At stage separation, slight differences in how the ship's engines started up caused the booster's flip maneuver to be off by roughly 90 degrees. 90 degrees isn't a rounding error. That's the difference between a controlled turn and a tumble. On the ship, the failure was different. A single vacuum Raptor engine, the kind designed to fire efficiently in the vacuum of space, shut down after separation. Vacuum engines and sea-level engines are tuned differently. A nozzle built for the vacuum of space behaves differently under the specific stresses of an ascent that starts in Earth's atmosphere and transitions to orbit. Two systems, two different physics problems, one shared root cause. This is a new generation of Raptor, Raptor 3, flying for only the second time in Starship's history. New hardware always finds its weak points during the earliest flights. That's not an excuse. That's how every rocket engine in history has been developed, including the ones flying cargo and astronauts safely today. The fix, and why it's bigger than a patch. So what did SpaceX actually change? This is where Flight 13 stops being a simple repeat and starts being a different mission entirely. On Super Heavy, SpaceX modified the hardware specifically to improve relight reliability. Alongside that, engineers rewrote the engine warning and abort logic, the automated system that decides whether an engine gets flagged as failing and shut down, or allowed to keep running. On a rocket with 33 engines, that decision-making system is arguably as important as the engines themselves. Shut an engine down too aggressively, and you lose thrust you didn't need to lose. Let a failing engine keep running too long, and you risk cascading damage to its neighbors. On the ship, SpaceX addressed the specific causes behind the vacuum Raptor shutdown, and, this is worth pausing on, confirmed that additional reliability improvements are planned for future Raptor variants. In other words, this isn't a one-time fix. This is SpaceX telling you the vacuum Raptor's evolution isn't finished. The startup sequence during stage separation was also rewritten to be more resistant to timing variability. The booster's flip, the one that went 90 degrees off course on Flight 12, should be dramatically cleaner this time. And the landing burn, the maneuver that ended with Super Heavy hitting the ocean at 1,400 kilometers per hour, is expected to start earlier on Flight 13, giving the booster more time to shed speed before it reaches the water. None of these are cosmetic changes. Each one targets a specific documented failure point from Flight 12. That's the difference between a company guessing at fixes and a company that instrumented every second of a failed landing and traced each anomaly back to its source. Now here's where the story takes a turn most viewers get wrong. If you've seen images of the Flight 13 vehicle, you've probably noticed something new. Patches of bright white tiles scattered across the heat shield, standing out against the familiar black. The obvious assumption is that white means upgraded, stronger, a new generation heat shield material. That assumption is incorrect. SpaceX says those white tiles serve two purposes, and neither one is stronger material. First, they're deliberately simulating missing tiles. Engineers intentionally creating weak points to see how the surrounding structure handles localized damage in real flight conditions, not in a lab. Second, they act as high visibility markers for a new set of tracking cameras riding on this exact mission. Think about what that means. SpaceX isn't just testing whether the heat shield survives. They're testing whether they can predict exactly where and how it might fail next, on purpose, with instruments watching, rather than waiting to find damage after splashdown like they did on every previous flight. That's the difference between reacting to problems and hunting for them before they become problems. It's a subtle shift, but it tells you something about where this program is in its development curve. Early Starship flights were about proving the vehicle could fly at all. Flight 13 is about proving SpaceX understands exactly why it flies the way it does, down to the tile. The satellites that changed the equation. Here's a detail that got buried in most coverage of Flight 13, and it might be the most consequential one on the entire manifest. Starship isn't carrying dummy mass on this flight. It's deploying 20 operational Starlink V3 satellites. The first time real revenue-generating hardware rides inside an operational Starship payload bay on a test flight. Every previous Starship mission carried simulators, deadweight shaped like satellites, with no function beyond testing the deployment mechanism. This time, the mechanism has to work. The payload door has to open correctly. The dispenser, nicknamed the Pez dispenser for the way it pushes payloads out sequentially, has to push 20 real satellites into orbit at the right trajectory, the right spacing, the right timing. Alongside them, 6 satellites carrying modified cameras with one specific job, photographing Starship's heat shield during re-entry and transmitting that imagery back for engineering analysis in near real time. Stop and consider what that means for the white tile strategy we just covered. SpaceX isn't only testing durability anymore. They're building an imaging network specifically to watch their own spacecraft fail, or succeed, from the outside, live, instead of waiting for a recovered vehicle to tell the story after the fact. 2 failures on Flight 12, a live camera network watching for the next one on Flight 13. That's not a coincidence. That's a company closing the gap between something went wrong and we know exactly what and where in real time. There's one more objective on Flight 13 that's been promised, delayed, and quietly dropped from the flight plan before, the in-space Raptor relight. This sounds simple on paper. Fire an engine that's already in space after it's been sitting cold and silent in a vacuum. In practice, it's one of the hardest engineering problems in reusable spaceflight. An engine relies on precise propellant flow, ignition timing, and structural stability that behave completely differently once gravity, atmosphere, and the temperature swings of orbit are added to the equation. Why does this matter beyond one test flight? Because every future Starship mission that matters, orbital refueling, deploying payloads to specific orbits, sending vehicles toward the moon under NASA's Artemis program, eventually pushing toward Mars, depends on the ability to shut an engine off in space and trust that it will fire again when needed. SpaceX has relit engines in space before, on earlier Starship and Falcon hardware, but Raptor 3 is a new generation of engine, on its second ever flight, still recovering from 2 documented failures on its debut. Every assumption about how it behaves in the vacuum of space has to be re-earned, not carried over from the old hardware. This is the test that turns Starship from a rocket that can reach orbit into a rocket that can operate in orbit. That distinction is the entire difference between a test program and an operational vehicle. What this actually means for the reusability timeline. Let's zoom out for a moment because the individual fixes only matter in the context of the bigger goal, full, rapid reusability. A Starship and Super Heavy that fly, land, get refueled, and fly again on a timeline measured in hours, not months. The heat shield data from Flight 12 is the strongest evidence yet that this goal is achievable. Oxidation has been almost completely eliminated compared to Flight 10 and Flight 11. That's not a marginal improvement. That's the primary blocker to catching Starship with the launch tower's mechanical arms, the way Super Heavy boosters are already being caught today. But reusability isn't just about the heat shield surviving re-entry. It's about the entire vehicle surviving every phase, every time, predictably enough that SpaceX can turn a booster around in days instead of rebuilding one from scratch. The engine failures on Flight 12 are the reminder that the program isn't there yet. 2 failures on 2 different engine types in one flight is not a reusability-ready failure rate. That's the honest tension sitting underneath Flight 13. The hardest problem, the heat shield, is trending towards solved. The problem everyone assumed was already mature, the engines, still has work to do. Flight 13 is the mission where SpaceX has to prove both stories are moving in the same direction at the same time. While the engine and heat shield story dominates the conversation, there's a quieter revolution happening on the ground, and it might matter just as much for the future of this program. Starship and Super Heavy together hold approximately 3,650 metric tons of propellant. On earlier flights, fueling that much liquid oxygen and liquid methane took the better part of an hour, sometimes longer, with the live stream already running by the time tanks started filling. On Flight 13's timeline, the entire fueling sequence, both vehicles, full propellant load, completes in roughly 30 minutes. Why does a ground systems upgrade deserve attention in a story about engines and heat shields? Because rapid reusability isn't only about the vehicle surviving flight. It's about how fast SpaceX can turn a rocket around between flights. A booster that lands safely but takes 6 hours to refuel isn't meaningfully more reusable than one that gets rebuilt from parts. Cutting fueling time in half is a direct, measurable step toward the stated goal of daily, or even multiple times per day, launches. It's the unglamorous infrastructure work that determines whether rapid reusability stays a slogan or becomes an actual operating rhythm. What happens if this doesn't work? It's worth asking this question. Most coverage skips entirely. What does it mean if Flight 13 doesn't go as planned? If the booster's engines fail again in the same way, relight failures during boost back, an off-target flip during stage separation, that's no longer a first flight anomaly. That's a pattern, and patterns are what force fundamental redesigns instead of incremental fixes. If the in-space Raptor relight fails again, after being delayed once already, the timeline for orbital refueling, the technology NASA is counting on for the Artemis moon landing architecture slips further. That's not just a SpaceX problem at that point. That becomes a program-wide scheduling problem for the next crewed lunar mission. And if the white tile experiment reveals that missing sections of heat shield cause damage to propagate faster than expected, that's a structural finding SpaceX needs before they ever consider putting a crew on top of this vehicle. None of that is meant to sound alarming for its own sake. It's meant to make one thing clear. Flight 13 isn't a victory lap after Flight 12's heat shield success. It's the mission where SpaceX finds out whether last flight's engine failures were bad luck on a brand new engine generation, or the first sign of a deeper problem in how 33 engines are asked to work as one system. That answer is coming, and it's coming soon. The data will tell the real story soon. Thanks for analyzing it with us. If this breakdown added up for you, like, share, comment, and subscribe to the Space Brief. More flight data waiting on screen.